I'd like to begin and welcome everyone to yet another digital session hosted by the Lahore Literary Festival. And today we have none other than Miss Jasmyn Rana with us. She is a relational integrative psychotherapist who's done her master's in training from Monash in Australia. And she spent much of the last decade setting up her own private practice here in Lahore. And alongside being an accredited supervisor, she's also taught courses and certificates in at university level relating and pertaining to the field and discipline of psychology and therapy and training. And her specialized areas of expertise and her passions include working with couples and adults. So welcome, Jasmyn.
Thank you, Eman. Thanks for having me.
Horace, how are you feeling today?
So now you're my therapist. I think that's a good question. How are we all feeling today? During this really strange time, but I'm okay today. I'm really grateful for the last 2 hours of good weather, because the heat and humidity has been crazy. But yeah, I'm grateful for that right now. Yeah.
Okay, so on that note, I'd also like to highlight that this is a mental health discussion. It's not only a very special topic, but it's very relevant, and we all relate to it at every level simply on virtue of being human. And given the extraordinary moment in history we're experiencing and living in, and the strict SOPs we have to follow because of the coronavirus or COVID-19, human interaction and human contact has been diminished to the point where, human connection has become sacred, but to an extent. So Jasmyn, my first question to you would be that as an integrative relational psychotherapist and someone who's doing therapy online, what do you say that what are the main mental health concerns of people these days?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, Iman, what you said, in terms of how the dynamics of relationships have changed, right? So because somewhere, some of us are in this pandemic in a sort of partial lockdown. We're in a partial lockdown here in isolation, and most of us here in Pakistan are actually in a lockdown with family. So either with nuclear family or with joint families. And I think it's really interesting and obviously difficult, and it has some positive aspects, and I'll speak a little bit about that, is how our intimate relationships have become really intense. So whether that's us being with ourselves or us being with our spouse or our parents or our children, and then a lot of our external relationships that we might have relied on heavily have all just transcended to some kind of online platform. And both these things are happening at the same time. And I think that's a lot to process. But when you ask me, and I can say a bit more about that, but when coming back to your question about what kind of general concerns, it's hard to answer that question. It's so broad, but one of the things that definitely I feel strongly is that whatever was underlying, maybe predating the pandemic, whether that was any kind of anxiety that I coped with well through our daily routine, or any kind of low feelings that I was avoiding through good coping mechanisms, or any kind of relational stress that I was putting to the side because, we both had space. Whatever we were carrying, the pandemic has collapsed all our regular copings. And so whatever we were carrying has become really acute. And I think for everyone, that's different.
And everyone's domestic situation is different as well, and there's a lot of domestic issues and domestic abuse that's also been on the rise because everyone's incarcerated, families are incarcerated with one another and with each other. So what would be a good way of coping with situations like that?
I know. This is such a big question in the world right now. I think as soon as in the early days of the pandemic, where the lockdown hit, which was actually in Europe before here, I don't think it was really predicted how much abuse rates would skyrocket till we had all these hotlines and different agencies that help families or they help women or they help kids of domestic abuse reporting that their numbers have gone like 25% higher, 30% higher. But when we really break it down, things that
Yes.
contribute to abuse are usually an abuse is a lack of control. Okay, they use their victim to kind of gain some sense of control. If you put us in a lockdown where there's economic insecurity, there's general anxiety and
Yes.
frustration, people who have abusive tendencies will wind up being more triggered. And the trouble is that the victim in this situation can't leave, especially when we were in like a full-time lockdown. And the combination of these things together is really actually devastating. And we're not just looking at spouses, we're looking at parents with kids. I think it was Greenland, they actually had to ban alcohol because of abuse against children that was happening. And a lot of governments did speak up about it around the world. I know organizations like Razan are trying to do something here. They've created a hotline. And when you say,
Okay.
what can we do? That's such a difficult question because abuse is such a fine balance. On one hand, we don't want to cope so well that we're actually enabling the abuse. Yeah, so we can have all these great
Right.
coping strategies. But then on the other hand, some people, there's a very real harsh reality here that they have nowhere to turn. Maybe their lives are, in danger, their kids are in danger, and what to do. So if you feel like there is any kind of physical abuse, sexual abuse, especially when kids and joint family systems are involved, or there's emotional abuse, then what you want to really think about is how can I put some boundaries in place that are protective? And even if that is just your area of the house, or if that's you keeping your kids with you, or if that's you being able to spend your time alone in the day, just very basic things, but you don't want to cope so well with extreme abuse that you're actually enabling it. And the reason I'm highlighting that so much, Eman, is because, we have a culture here that kind of promotes कि चलो कोई नहीं, at least मारता तो नहीं है तो ऐसे कर लेता है. So we already do this so much
And that's
with
enabling
women.
the other person. That's accepting their behavior, which in turn makes them act more, I mean, fundamentally and fanatically later on. I mean, if you
Yeah,
accept the
yeah,
abuse.
absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, I think the biggest thing is to identify if you do feel like there's some kind of abuse, and then look out for your own resources. Who can you reach out to in your family? Do you have a safe place that you can go? Do you have other resources? And if not, what are some of the other resources available? If you're in a critical situation, Razan is one of them. They're doing
Okay,
a lot
so
of free work for, homes that are suffering with domestic abuse right now.
could you repeat the name of the organization again?
Rozan, and I'll put it here. I'll send it to you. Rozan. Yeah.
ROZ. And in terms of other resources, because you mentioned, that there are
Yeah.
resources available, but for some people who cannot afford them, and for some people who can afford them, what are the other resources available for
Yeah.
for personal welfare and domestic welfare?
Yeah. I think that's a very like relevant question because during this time, it's a really reflective time actually, where I think before COVID it was started to peak here, and before we started to see a lot of illness and death, and now that we're going through that really difficult part of the cycle. Before this, people were like, wow, we've not been home, we've not read so much, we've not thought so much, we've not noticed so much about our anxiety or our relationship. So you might not be going through any kind of abuse, but you might want to use this time to self-reflect. And if you can't afford therapy, there is an organization that's doing great work. It's called Umang. It starts with a U, Umang. And they provide free therapy. It's run on a volunteer basis. I believe that someone gets in touch with you within 24 hours or maybe 48 hours if you leave them a query. And then if you can afford it, I think what we were actually facing was an avalanche of people who wanted therapy suddenly in the pandemic. And besides the fact that there's, heightened anxiety and heightened stress levels, we're actually, it makes sense. Like, we're stuck at home and we're being reflective and we want to use this time for some inner work as well. And therapists they were reaching out to were full. So a colleague of mine, Daheen Dean, and myself, we've actually put together a directory. We're still working on it, where you can come have an online consultation with any one of us, and we'll pair you up with a therapist who's actually will work well with you, because a lot of therapeutic results, they really rely heavily on the relationship, the healing relationship, not just the technique, but the person, and how well do you work with them. And we have people from like Karachi, Islamabad, Dubai. We have a few international people. We have a lot of therapists from Lahore. And all those people are ethical and, well reputed and well trained. And so that's a safe way if you don't know who to go to, or the therapist you wanted to go to doesn't have time.
Okay. Jasmyn, so now that we've identified that everyone's having anxiety and there's this constant question in everyone's mind that is this normal or is this the new normal? I want you to shed a bit more light on social media and how toxic it can be in its spread of resources and knowledge. For example, everyone on WhatsApp's a doctor, everyone on Instagram's an influencer, and everyone on Twitter is an activist. So what do we do? Anyone could just get up and say everything, and there's a lot of bullying going on like that online as well. And of course, children who are not in school, they're being bullied online. So I mean that also contributes to the mental health crisis during this ongoing pandemic.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think this is such an important and conflicting question, because before the pandemic, most of the world stood very safely on the side, especially as far as bullying in kids and resources, as far as following influencers or how much screen time we had. Get too much screen time is just not good for you. Even if you're a safe adult who's not going to be bullied, which can happen to adults too, but too much screen time takes away from mindfulness, it takes away from human interaction. But what's happened in the pandemic is that isolation also has really detrimental effects. And especially when we're looking at cities and countries who went through complete periods of complete lockdown and complete isolation. And I would say, especially unlike our culture, people who are locked down absolutely alone. And online has actually become a way to connect, a way to speak to your parents, a way to, maybe the only way to speak to your parents, the only way to speak to your siblings. In your house, it might be one of the only accesses you have to different resources, like if you can't get books, if you're reading online. So I think there's a very fine line. When, as far as mental health resources, if you can't access therapy, you can access some good endorsed pages, by people, different people who've done great work in different areas. You can access a lot of creative outlets. You can access literature and music, and you can access a lot of things that we wouldn't have actually had back, maybe, of course, in the Spanish flu would have been locked down. But I think there's a fine line. How much can we let our kids just become so used to this interfaced interacting, how much bullying actually does happen, and those dynamics will play out. The problem with social media is they almost happen silently. So it's not like you're not in a playground anymore where there are other kids and there are other people and it's being witnessed in your house. You're a teenager and you're probably unlikely to speak up at home, and then you're going through all of this. What kind of content are you following that can be dangerous? To like mindfulness, so we're not really using all our senses. There's something unnatural about this. So I think you want to treat it with caution. You want to use it sparingly. You want to limit it to what really matters to you. What are you really using it for? And not just use it all the time, because it is addictive. And a lot of studies have shown that.
One other thing that I also picked up from my social media and my social media habits, I often throw around the word or mental health illnesses very casually, that, oh, I have anxiety, oh, I have depression. But I think that's really debilitating and debasing and very discouraging for people who actually do have those mental health illnesses at a greater scale. So have you noticed that as well? I don't think anyone's
Yeah,
brought that up, but I thought it was very important to highlight.
yeah, I think this is really important. I think Eman, what you're highlighting is critical, and you're actually highlighting maybe the most polite end of the spectrum, because sometimes we use that are really demeaning casually, and they have serious mental health implications. And I think it needs to be spoken about by people like you who are raising it on platforms like this. And we don't want to take it lightly. We don't want to assume that anxiety is just the mood of the moment for a few seconds. So when you actually come to me and tell me that you're struggling with anxiety, it's so much easier for me casually. On the other hand, as much as I would never endorse using it casually, it is a reflection that people are thinking about mental health more. So they are picking up on words, on feelings, they're picking up on terms like anxiety and depression, and it's kind of being integrated into our vocab. And I think as a society, over the last decade, we have slowly, I've been witnessing that we've been really moving towards that. But obviously these are the side effects where we start taking it very casually, and we want to be mindful and sensitive not to do that.
I agree. And also, I wanted to ask you a bit more about, obviously it's about COVID-19 and it's a very difficult time for all of us, but I think it's particularly difficult mentally for coronavirus patients. Initially, when coronavirus came to Lahore, people were talking about like sending screenshots and messages on WhatsApp to each other that, oh, this person has coronavirus, this person has coronavirus, and it became a joke, and that's not good for the person who actually is a coronavirus patient. So
yeah. So
I
I
just
think
think we
what you're
should be
talking
mindful about that as well.
Yeah, this is really important, because for some reason something happened here where and I think without pointing too many fingers, it's really to do with our government and the way that some things were handled, where it led to a lot of corona shaming, where if I were to have it, I would be afraid to tell people. Even if I know that it's safe, I'm not going to be picked up and taken forcefully to some kind of quarantine center, but because it's generated so much shame around it. And I think that what we saw here in early days is we were getting a lot of media coming in from Europe and countries that were peaking. And I think the government, without reading too much into how or why they did the things that they did, is they acted out of a lot of panic. There were houses being targeted where there were police surrounding the house, and then there were scary stories of what quarantine centers were, whereas the rest of the world was following a protocol that if you have it, we know that our hospitals will be exhausted at some point. We want you to stay home. We want you to quarantine until it is, until you have any of those critical symptoms, which is what we're doing now. And so one thing that we had with our government's way of managing it was a lot of inconsistency. And that created a lot of panic, and in the process that created a lot of shaming, and having it, it almost creates this instinct, this fearful instinct, this very primitive feeling where I'll be kicked out of my tribe and then I won't survive. And I don't want that. And so all of us, we, more than maybe the actual symptoms of, I think for at least the last month, it's getting better now, people were struggling with the shame of COVID. And yeah, so I mean, I could go on and on about that, but that was
because
a really
it is a novel virus, and we don't know anything about it, and there's cases of reports of people dying, and it affects you really. You don't want to have any mental impact, which is why people don't tell other people. But at the same time, I just think we should be mindful of these things, that it's something that's going around, and it could be just about any of us. You have to be responsible for the other person, their feelings.
Absolutely.
It's something that no one knows anything about. It could happen to anyone.
Absolutely. So like if someone, has been or is or was or could be diagnosed, where is our empathy and our concern? As long as, yes, we have to be following SOPs and taking cautions, but where is all of that when we start kind of COVID shaming them? And that's something really to be looked at. I don't think, in too many other places in the world. And I think that, it's a novel virus, so we didn't know how to handle it. But, the top down has an impact on the way we receive information. So just like if we have little kids at home, the way we kind of process it, even if we don't know, it's a new situation, it's a new crisis, but the way we kind of handle it, it gives them a certain level of security or insecurity. And I think inconsistency creates a lot of insecurity. And so I think what happened with our government is that we went from extreme measures to a lockdown, to no lockdown, to really relaxed measures, to the death rate soaring.
Gaslighting.
Absolutely.
The government saying that there's hospital beds and there's no hospital beds, and there's people that actually have sick parents and sick family members, and it's actually humiliating for your citizens that something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and what does gaslighting do is that it creates a lot of unsafety. So if I'm a child with a parent, or if I'm just a citizen relying on my government, but it creates a lot of unsafety that I have to look out for myself. And I cannot rely on the information I'm being given or the resources I'm being told about. What I'm being told might not even be true. So it triggers even more internal anxiety, panic, trauma responses. And I think we do have a little bit of that here. And we most definitely are constantly looking out for our own resources because we can't fully rely on what we're being told sometimes. And it's not just to target our government. We saw this happening in different parts of the world. We saw this happen in Brazil before they really peaked. We saw, their government come out and completely deny the existence of COVID. What would that do to anxiety levels? So we're seeing people are getting sick. We're hearing about it. Rather than coming out and saying, we don't know, we're figuring it out. This is the first time we're managing a situation. We're going to keep, changing our protocols, and to come out and say, oh, it doesn't even exist, or, we have an extreme lockdown, or now we don't. It creates a lot of anxiety, and I think that has added to our collective anxiety as a nation.
I agree. I also wanted to highlight the therapist's perspective as the opined for Psych Central about the therapist perspective, and it's called A Glance into a Therapist's Window in the Time of COVID-19. So I want you to explain a bit more for the fellow therapists that are watching, that they're not alone, and then just summarize what you wrote, because I thought it was a very beautiful and very insightful piece.
Okay, yeah. So what that piece was written really early in the pandemic, and I'm seeing a really good question here by Ash, which we can come to, and I'll quickly go over
Yeah.
this. I'm mindful of time. Do we have time, Iman, to go on for a little while?
We can go on for a little bit. That's fine.
Okay, so
We
I'll
have
try to
some
be
time.
quick.
Okay.
Okay, so the article really highlighted that if I really get to the core of it, it was early days in the pandemic and it was
It was
confusing.
April.
We were not on the front lines. Yeah, it was confusing because we weren't on the front lines here. We didn't have COVID, but we had a lot of the media from Europe and different places that were really impacted, and it was absolutely new, and there was a lot of panic. And so people went into lockdowns, and everyone started. What that article says is that we all started to have, let's call it some form of anxiety, but we can call it the different stages of grief. We can call it different emotions. We can call it some sense of loss or some kind of liberation. Some people felt relieved when their obligations were taken away and burdens were taken away and they were given a break. And what that article says is that it's really important to pay attention to what's coming up for you, even if it's anxiety. Anxiety is not necessarily a bad thing. Anxiety is informing you of something that's lingering within you that you're not addressing. Or if you feel liberated because you're in the pandemic or you're in a lockdown state, that's informing you about something of the way you were living your life before, some kind of overload. So that article is like, we're having these unique responses. Maybe this is the only time in our lives we ever go through something like this. This is definitely the first time in any of our lives we've ever been through something like this. And it's really useful to look within and reflect on what's coming up for you.
And I think that's very important that you gave this preeminent sort of, I mean, some information that if you do have anxiety, then it's okay. You will have anxiety because you will be isolated. It'll be something different from the normal. That
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So this kind of expectation that we have where we're supposed to feel good and fine, I mean, that's really unrealistic. Anxiety is helpful. It's programmed, it's hardwired into our biology for survival. If you're having anxiety, it might not be so simple, even though with COVID, it kind of does simplify the anxiety, but there's something lingering and there's something you don't know that's causing you anxiety. It's something that needs your attention. And that anxiety is actually a helpful tool. So if I hurt my hand, I experience pain so that my brain knows to tend to the wound. We want to treat our feelings of feeling low or loss or anxiety, something like that, as something to be curious about.
and
And yeah.
I also wanted to talk about, because you're a mother as well, so and everyone's having online school. How do you cope with little children who are in their formative years, but they can't go out, they can't meet their friends, they can't meet their grandparents? So how are you coping with their development and their growth at this point in time?
Yeah, I think that it's really tough in its own way on kids. So if you're looking at the younger kids, they might not be able to express the way we express or to identify, but they might be frustrated, they might be missing things, they might be missing family members, they might be missing daily routines that they had, basic interaction. And for sure, there's something really unnatural about just being locked down in a house. So I would say the best thing you can do is talk to them, ask them how they're feeling, what they're missing. It's okay, it's safe to acknowledge that life has changed. Open those dialogues, however much they reciprocate or not. And then the other basic things you can do with kids is, create a little bit of routine, create a little bit of outside time, create, more human interaction. So if it's you and your kids, yes, it's sad, none of the other important people are there, but you don't want to rely on screens or self-play as much as maybe it was easier to when they were spending time with aunts and cousins and grandparents in school. You want to do more of the, the parent-child time as well. So they're getting a bit of the human interaction, because you're right, they're spending all those hours in front of a screen just for school. So I think it's tricky, and it goes by age, through age group to age group, and it's important to talk about what it is, what the virus is, how it's impacting us on these things. And Eman, Ash Williams' question here.
Yeah, please
about
answer
the divide. Yeah, okay, I would say that's really relevant to what you're asking as well, in terms of homes and kids, and so much divide has been created within, before we even start to look at society, like society who takes it seriously and society who really actually doesn't even believe. We have a huge segment of, they don't even believe that corona is valid, and they think it's a conspiracy, right? If you go out to all these small villages, and even within
I've
homes,
met a lot of people like that too. Even in Lahore, I've met a lot of people like that.
Imagine even in Lahore, so a lot of our rural areas, they don't believe that corona exists. They think it's some kind of propaganda, and they have a very strong belief system, and they make up a very big part of our population. So we have that divide there in society. But even within homes, I think within couples, within families that are living together, within parents who have teenagers, or joint families, around what kind of SOPs are we following? People are in conflict. They're like, why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? And I was, we really don't know what are the best SOPs. It's easier when the government gives it and it's straightforward. We don't have that right now. A lot of our kind of cautions have been taken away, even though the virus is getting worse. So then people are coming up with their own kind of safety. And what it is it's a trauma response. So if a lion or I see COVID-19, the way I respond or plan to respond, especially when that stressor is there for a long time. It's not just a moment. It's not just a moment of peaked anxiety. It's a prolonged anxiety that I'm living with. It's almost like when we're living with some kind of domestic abuse, right? How do we cope with that? And the way you cope and the way that I cope will be different. So some of us will cope by being really positive. Some of us will cope by being extra cautious. Absolutely, internalize it. Some of us will do things like gaslight it. If acknowledging a threat is something that is alien to us, it's so threatening to us, it's something that we have some kind of trauma within our past, we'll say, you know what, it doesn't exist. And then these little fragmentations start happening. And so not only are we facing them at large with the public, we're facing them in homes, we're facing them in relationships. And I think by all means, we need to stick to whatever, the sort of SOPs are, but we need to notice that everyone's reaction is coming from their own trauma response. In regard to the masses, I would say there's been a lot of consistency and communication when COVID-19 news was being broadcast. So we were being told things like, we have this virus, it's deadly, but we don't need a lockdown, and yet there is a lockdown announced the next day. So then why would I take that lockdown seriously? Every time that there was a lockdown, there was a parallel kind of speech given about how we don't need a lockdown. And, I understand the whole premise behind it, economic reasons, but when the communication is so inconsistent, just like a parent to a child, we will then cope in our own way. We will not trust authority figures. We will not trust information. We will choose to cope by denial, maybe. And I think that's what's happening in a big part of our country, where there is such a lack of faith.
We'll have trust issues, simply put.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if I have trust issues with my parent or I have trust issues with my government, my reaction will be similar, where I won't necessarily take what they are saying seriously. And I think we're seeing that reflective that half our country, that's a broad statement, I don't know data on this, but so many people, they don't even believe that the virus exists. And that says something about the communication between the government and the people.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's a question by Brinda Gulati from Delhi, and she says, "How can we continue having conversations about mental health post-COVID? What's the new normal?"
Yeah, the new normal. That seems to be a term that we are really trying to figure out. I think it's great that you're asking this about mental health. Okay, so this question's from Delhi. I'm assuming culturally it's similar. Here in Lahore, in Pakistan, in the last 10 years, I feel like we have been building up to a lot more awareness on mental health. And I think the pandemic has really made a lot of that awareness acute. It's made us a little more empathetic to what people are going through, a little more aware of different things that people could go through, a little more cognizant of our internal world. And I don't see any of that slipping away. You know, it's not something that happened, like some kind of media fad for a week or some kind of celebrity story. We've been building up to this point, and then this has been a prolonged time where there's been genuine distress, and now we're hitting that time where people around us are being diagnosed, people are facing loss, we're facing real grief, we're facing real anxiety about the whole process. So I think that this will be a part of the new normal, is more open dialogues on mental health.
Someone else asked how to tell others that you're having anxiety and you need your space, especially with being locked down with family who might not necessarily take it seriously or acknowledge it. This is Sophia Usman from Riyadh,
Okay, hi
Saudi
Sophia.
Arabia.
So, I actually did speak on this for another platform in a lot more detail, but it's really relevant actually to our part of the world, because what we're hearing in the Western media is how do you cope with isolation, and how do you cope with isolation and tips to cope with all the isolation. And what's more relevant here is sometimes how do we cope suddenly with being 10 people in a home, and not having personal space or boundaries. And what we have is a lot of population living in small homes, or we have huge homes with plenty of space, but we don't experience that space. So because I know that so and so's home and so and so's home and everyone's there, and I cannot feel relaxed. And that's something you want to look into. So why is it that some people feel really relaxed and some people don't? And of course, there's external situations, but you want to question, okay, how am I doing with my internal space? So if I have X, Y, Z different family members around me, is it okay for me to check out of their needs, to check out of their mood, even if they're really happy and they expect me to be happy, or they're feeling anxious, can I not get sucked into that? And is it okay for me to check into myself? And that's our experience of internal space. So I think that that's something for those of us who are in lockdown with many people might want to consider. So physical space matters, yes, boundaries matter, but beyond that, it doesn't matter how much physical space I give you. If you don't have internal space, you'll still struggle.
And that's very important to highlight. Brinda asked again, is there a pragmatic way to stay informed while logging off so as to reduce screen time? That's a relevant question, I feel.
Yeah, that's very relevant. I wish there was a simple answer, but what I would say is, use your screen time mindfully. So decide, X, Y, Z, these are the resources I trust, or these are the news resources, or these are the therapeutic resources, or this is the entertainment I want to access. This is how much I want to access it. And don't do that thing, what do they call it? It's like mindless browsing. It's like flicking TV channels. Mindfully go, decide to access something, and then mindfully leave it. And that's probably the best way to manage that.
I agree. I think we're gonna wrap up the session. Do you have any concluding remarks to make, Jasmyn?
I think I will say that a lot of the talks, I usually don't do as many talks, but I've been trying to just do justice to the field of mental health while people are really struggling. And a lot of the talks leading up to this point have been about reflecting inwards. And I think that's so relevant. I would advise people to keep doing that. I hate to leave this on a gloomy note, but I think we're about to hit a very difficult part of the virus for us geographically. We're speaking from here, from Lahore in Pakistan, and where grief and loss and everything, it is being heightened. You know, we are peaking, and it's very natural to start to feel like you're struggling more now. The lockdown, or this kind of partial lockdown, has been prolonged. COVID has been prolonged, and now suddenly, you know, we have news of loss, and we have feelings of grief, we have anxiety for loved ones. So maybe just really give yourself that kindness and space, and don't be critical. Yeah, okay, by now it should be okay, you know, this has been going on for a while. Now is the time where things actually might get even harder, and to really allow yourself to do that internal reflecting.
And I think it's also really, really important to do mental health checks on your friends, even if it's just saying, hi, how are you? You don't know. It's a very difficult time for
Yeah.
everyone. And you just dropping that message, they'll probably remember it forever if they're going through it. And it makes us nothing less than a bit more to do that, to do a mental health check on our friends.
Yes, I think Iman, that's a really good point. You know, kind of like a social responsibility to try to be more aware of what other people might be going through, how they might be experiencing it, and how their experience might be very different from your way of coping. And it's important. And I think one of the things that you're saying is the check-ins. They can be really helpful for a lot of people.
Been very helpful
Yeah.
that way, that's for sure.
Yes. Yes.
But I think we will wrap this up. Thank you so much for coming, Jasmyn.
Thank you
We
so
have
much for
we have a
you.
great response today, and mental health is a very important topic. And I think everyone should tap into their resources. Go online, not on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Go on proper psychology pages, or go talk to a
Yeah.
therapist. And all the
Yeah.
resources Jasmyn has mentioned, I'll probably list them down later. But do seek help if you need it. Right.
Yes. Absolutely.
Thank you
Thank you,
so much.
Iman, and thanks to LS for having me.
Of course. Thank you, Jasmine. Bye.
Okay. Bye.